I stood on the polished teak deck of my $350 million mega yacht swirling a crystal flute of vintage champagne. Down below on the concrete pier, my mother-in-law Patricia was weeping into her hands, begging armed harbor authorities not to maroon her on a Caribbean island. But to understand how the discarded wife became the executioner, we have to rewind exactly 72 hours. My name is Gabriella. I am 31 years old. For the past 3 years, I lived under my mother's maiden name, Cole, running a modest marine conservation startup. I wanted a self-reliant life in New Hampshire far away from the blinding glare of my family wealth. Before I tell you exactly how I let my arrogant in-laws dig their own watery grave, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. You are tuned in to Sarah Told Stories, so hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind toxic people exactly who they are dealing with. The air inside the upscale Portsmouth seafood restaurant smelled of roasted garlic and melted butter. I sat quietly next to my husband Donovan, sipping sparkling water while his mother Patricia tapped a silver spoon against her wine glass. She commanded the table, pulling a stack of thick, glossy envelopes from her designer handbag. With a theatrical flourish, she passed them around. One went to Donovan. One went to her aspiring influencer daughter, Kendra. The last one slid toward Kendra's husband, Todd. I watched Donovan slide his thumb under the gold foil seal. His eyes lit up. Patricia beamed, resting her elbows on the white linen tablecloth. She announced she had purchased platinum tier tickets for a 2-week luxury commercial cruise through the Caribbean. I extended my hand, offering a polite smile, expecting my envelope. Patricia stopped smiling. She reached back into her leather tote and pulled out a thick spiral-bound packet. She dropped it right onto my dinner plate. The laminated cover read House Sitting and Pet Care Guide. The clinking of silverware at the adjacent tables seemed to fade away. Patricia leaned forward, resting her chin on folded hands. She loudly declared that a premium cruise simply was not the place for my budget-conscious granola aesthetic. She said my thrift store wardrobe would just embarrass the family at the captain's dinner. The young waitress refilling our water glasses froze her cheeks, burning bright red, as she witnessed the blatant humiliation. My chest tightened, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I turned my head toward Donovan. I waited for my husband to slide his platinum ticket back across the table. I waited for him to defend his wife. Instead, Donovan picked up his wine glass, stared down at his half-eaten salmon, and took a long, slow sip. The silence between us tasted like ash. I picked up the house-sitting manual and tucked it neatly into my purse. They thought they had just secured a flawless victory, but they had no idea they just handed a loaded weapon to a billionaire heiress. The drive back to our New Hampshire home was suffocating. The towering pines of the White Mountains blurred past the passenger window, a dark, jagged wall shielding us from the rest of the world. Inside the sedan, the only sound was the rhythmic thud of the tires against the cold asphalt and the faint hum of the heater. Donovan sat in the driver's seat, perfectly relaxed. He tapped his index finger against the leather steering wheel, humming a soft tune under his breath. He had just watched his mother publicly hand his wife a pet care manual instead of a vacation ticket, and his heart rate had not even spiked. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the smooth synthetic fabric of my practical skirt. I had spent 3 years curating this version of myself. I drove a reliable used sedan, I clipped coupons, I ran a marine conservation startup out of a rented co-working space. I did it all because growing up surrounded by unimaginable wealth taught me that money attracts predators. I wanted a partner who loved the woman I was in the quiet moments, not the billionaire heiress who could buy islands on a whim. Tonight, the final test had arrived, and Donovan was failing it with flying colors. I turned my head away from the dark window and looked at the profile of the man I married. The glow of the dashboard illuminated the sharp line of his jaw. I decided to offer him one final lifeline, one chance to prove that the vows he took actually meant something. "Donovan," I said, my voice steady and low, "if you care about this marriage, you will walk into the house, take that platinum cruise ticket out of your jacket, and tear it into pieces right in front of me." He did not grip the steering wheel tighter. He did not brake. He merely let out a sharp, patronizing sigh. He kept his eyes locked on the road ahead, playing the part of the exhausted, reasonable husband dealing with an irrational wife. "Do not start this, Gabriella," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "You are being entirely too sensitive. My mother was making a practical decision. You hate dressing up. You hate spending money. You always talk about saving the coral reefs and reducing our carbon footprint. A luxury liner just is not your scene. Why would she waste a $10,000 suite on someone who insists on drinking tap water and wearing canvas sneakers?" He was gaslighting me without a shred of hesitation. He was trying to rewrite a blatant act of cruelty into a logical favor. "She handed me a chore list, Donovan," I replied, holding his gaze. "She told me to clean her gutters while you drink champagne in the Caribbean." He rolled his eyes, navigating a sharp curve in the road. "You bring this on yourself, Gabriella. You constantly refuse to adapt to our lifestyle. My family is going places. We are elevating our social circle. We have standards to maintain. When you show up to dinner wearing thrift store cardigans, it drags down our entire aesthetic. You make us look like we are struggling." The sheer delusion pouring out of his mouth was staggering. He was lecturing a woman whose family owned half the global shipping lanes about elevating social circles. "You think a commercial cruise line makes you elite?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Donovan scoffed a harsh grating sound that echoed in the confined space of the car. "It is a platinum-tier experience, Gabriella, but you would not understand that. You just do not know the first thing about the ocean or real luxury." The irony of his statement hit me with the force of a freight train. It was a statement so dense, with staggering ignorance, that I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. He was telling the sole heir to the Meyer Maritime conglomerate that she did not understand the ocean. He was trying to gatekeep the concept of luxury from a woman who grew up taking helicopter lessons on a custom-built mega yacht. In that precise moment, the final thread tying my heart to this man snapped. It was a clean surgical break. My 3-year experiment acting as a middle-class civilian was officially over. The man sitting next to me was not a loving partner. He was a social climbing parasite. He viewed me as a disposable prop, a convenient stepping stone who paid the household bills while he chased his illusions of grandeur. He did not want an equal. He wanted an audience. We pulled into the driveway of our suburban home. The gravel crunched beneath the tires. Donovan put the car in park and unbuckled his seatbelt. He did not open my door. He grabbed his keys and walked straight toward the front porch, leaving me sitting alone in the dark. I stepped out into the crisp New Hampshire air. The wind howled through the pine branches, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and wood smoke. I walked inside and found Donovan already in the master bedroom. He had pulled 2 expensive designer suitcases from the closet and laid them open on our bed. He was humming that same tune, pulling silk ties and tailored linen shirts from his drawers. He moved with a frantic, greedy energy. He was discarding his marriage for a 2-week vacation, and he could not pack fast enough. I stood in the doorway, leaning my shoulder against the doorframe. I did not yell. I did not throw his clothes onto the floor. I watched him smooth out a pair of expensive slacks with careful, precise hands. He was treating his luggage with far more respect than he had ever shown me. "You are really packing," I stated simply. Donovan did not even look up. "The ship leaves in 2 days, Gabriella. I need to make sure my wardrobe is ready for the networking events on board. Todd and Kendra are already booking private excursions, and I need to coordinate with them. We are rubbing shoulders with serious investors this week." I pulled my cell phone from the pocket of my skirt. I needed to ensure he remained entirely complacent. If he sensed even a fraction of the danger hovering over his head, he might attempt to hide his assets or cancel his trip. I needed him to board that ship thinking he had won. I needed him to sail away believing he held all the cards. I opened my messaging application and drafted a short, direct text message. I addressed it to his number. "I am speaking to a local New Hampshire mediator tomorrow morning about separating our assets." I hit send. A second later, his phone buzzed loudly on the wooden nightstand. Donovan paused his packing. He reached over, picked up the device, and read the notification glowing on the screen. I watched his facial muscles shift. The initial surprise morphed rapidly into a smug, satisfied smirk. He let out a low chuckle and tossed the phone back onto the nightstand. He looked at me, his eyes filled with patronizing pity. "A local mediator," he mocked, shaking his head. "You really are predictable, Gabriella. Always looking for the cheap, budget-friendly way out. You think a mediator is going to scare me? My mother has 3 corporate lawyers on speed dial. But if you want to waste your little startup revenue on a strip mall referee, go right ahead. I will have my people review whatever paperwork you scrape together when I get back from the islands." His reaction was flawless. The red herring worked perfectly. He believed I was pursuing a slow, quiet, and incredibly cheap separation. He pictured us sitting in a drab beige office, dividing up the living room furniture and negotiating custody of the microwave. He thought I lacked the resources to mount a real legal offense. I did not offer a rebuttal. I simply nodded, projecting the exact image of a defeated, exhausted woman. "Have a safe trip, Donovan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned his back on me, returning to his designer luggage. He carefully folded a cashmere sweater, patting it down into the corner of the suitcase. He was blind to the federal trap I was actively building beneath his feet. He thought he was leaving a helpless tech worker behind. He had no idea he was stepping into the crosshairs of a billionaire who was about to turn his entire life into a cautionary tale. I stepped away from the bedroom door, leaving him to his delusions. The house was quiet, but my mind was operating with terrifying speed. The emotional severing was finalized. Now it was time to examine the structural damage. I walked down the hallway toward my home office, ready to review the financial framework of our separation. I expected to find a clean break. I expected to calculate a simple division of modest bank accounts. I pushed open the door to my office, ready to start the paperwork. But what I was about to find waiting inside my corporate ledger would escalate this quiet divorce into a devastating federal crime. The emotional severing was finalized the moment Donovan turned his back on me in the bedroom, but the true scope of his betrayal was just waiting to be unearthed. I walked down the quiet hallway of our suburban home, leaving the muffled sounds of his frantic packing behind. I pushed open the door to my home office and stepped into a sanctuary of sterile organization. The room was minimalist, painted in stark white, holding only a sleek glass desk and dual curved monitors. This was the command center for Aegis Oceanics, the marine conservation tech startup I had built entirely from scratch. I wanted to prove I could generate success using my own intellect, far removed from the towering shadow of my family logistics empire. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair and pressed the power button on my primary workstation. The processor hummed a low, steady rhythm against the silence of the house. I needed to untangle our household finances before meeting with the mediator I had referenced in my text message. I opened my encrypted browser and navigated to the commercial banking portal intended to separate my operational business capital from our shared domestic expenses. I typed my credentials into the login screen. My phone buzzed with a two-factor authentication request. I approved the prompt and watched the dashboard load. I expected to see a healthy runway of capital secured during my last round of independent fundraising. Instead, the screen rendered a glaring scarlet warning banner spanning the entire width of the interface. The text was stark and unmistakable. Insufficient funds. I stared at the digital readout, feeling a sudden sharp drop in my stomach. The primary checking account designated for vendor payouts and research development displayed a negative balance of $312. My initial reaction was sheer confusion. I ran a highly disciplined ledger. I never authorized overdrafts. I leaned closer to the monitor, the pale blue light reflecting in my eyes. I switched my mental state from a rejected wife to a forensic auditor. Growing up surrounded by global shipping magnates had taught me how to read a balance sheet long before I learned how to drive. I clicked on the raw transaction history, bypassing the simplified dashboard to access the unredacted digital ledger. The breadcrumbs were sloppy, revealing a terrifying pattern of financial manipulation. 3 months ago, the structural integrity of the corporate account had been quietly altered. A secondary administrative profile was added, granting sweeping authorization to approve outbound transfers without triggering an alert to my primary phone. I pulled the digital authorization form stored in the bank archive. Staring back at me was a flawless replication of my own signature appended to a sweeping line of credit application. Donovan had not just guessed my password. He had scavenged my signature from our joint tax returns, digitized it, and applied it to a fraudulent corporate mandate. He weaponized my pristine credit rating to open a shadow channel within my own company. I forced my breathing to remain slow and measured. I tracked the outbound routing numbers, watching the money bleed out in small, untraceable increments over the past 90 days. But the final catastrophic blow stood out like a neon sign. Barely 48 hours prior, a singular expedited wire transfer had cleared the holding account. $45,000 vanished into the digital ether in one swift execution. I ran the clearinghouse routing code through a global merchant database. The vendor identification number returned a direct match in Miami, Florida. It belonged to the exact luxury commercial cruise conglomerate Patricia had boasted about at dinner. I clicked into the sub-invoice attached to the wire transfer. The itemized receipt listed a premium cabin upgrade designated specifically for Patricia, changing her standard booking to the highly coveted penthouse suite. Below that were charges for top-tier unlimited beverage packages and exclusive offshore excursion passes registered under the names Kendra and Todd. The reality of the screen washed over me with a chilling, paralyzing clarity. Donovan did not just accept a free ticket from his generous mother. He had orchestrated the entire lavish spectacle using my hard-earned operational capital. He had robbed my company to purchase the very exclusion I was forced to endure at the restaurant. He sat across from me, sipping wine while knowing full well that my blood, sweat, and tears were funding his family vacation. This was not a petty domestic dispute over a shared checking account. This was a severe escalation into felony corporate wire fraud. He had forged documents, crossed state lines with illicit transfers, and embezzled seed money from a registered entity. He had crossed a legal Rubicon from which there was zero return. I sat back in my chair, letting the profound stupidity of his actions. The irony was so rich it was almost cinematic. That specific $45,000 was not random operating cash. It was carefully ring-fenced capital. It was the exact sum required to finalize the expedited global patent filing for a proprietary microplastic filtration algorithm I had spent 2 years developing. Under the marital property laws of New Hampshire, Donovan was legally positioned as a 50% beneficiary of any assets generated during our union. Once that patent hit the open market, the initial licensing rounds were conservatively projected to yield a staggering valuation in the tens of millions. He was standing on the precipice of legitimate generational wealth. Yet he possessed a vision so narrow, so inherently cheap, that he threw away an ironclad claim to millions just so his mother could drink free margaritas on a crowded Lido deck. He traded an empire for a buffet line. I reached for my mouse, my shock hardening into a diamond-sharp tactical focus. I did not shed a single tear for the death of my marriage. The man packing designer shirts down the hall was a parasite, and parasites deserve no grief. I initiated a full export of the transaction hashes securing the IP addresses linked to the forged digital signature. I downloaded the merchant receipts, the wire confirmations, and the timeline of the administrative override. I compiled the evidence into a locked, encrypted folder on a cold storage drive. The digital trap was officially armed, holding enough raw data to guarantee a federal indictment. I powered down the primary workstation, leaving the office exactly as I found it. The sun would rise in a few hours. The cruise terminal would be swarming with eager passengers. Kendra would undoubtedly seek validation through her phone camera, desperate to broadcast her fabricated elite status to the world. Let her preen. Let them all celebrate their stolen luxury. They were setting the stage for their own public execution, and I was more than ready to watch them fall. The house felt hollow the morning after Donovan dragged his designer luggage out the front door. The distinct chill of the New Hampshire autumn seeped through the kitchen window panes, leaving a thin layer of frost on the glass. I stood at the granite countertop grinding dark roast coffee beans, listening to the sharp whir of the blades echoing in the silent room. The isolation was profound, but I did not feel lonely. I felt an intense, liberating clarity. My phone buzzed against the cold stone surface. A push notification illuminated the lock screen, demanding immediate attention. Kendra was broadcasting live. Kendra had spent the last 5 years desperately chasing internet fame, curating a digital persona built on hollow luxury and sponsored energy drinks. She possessed a ravenous hunger for external validation, constantly measuring her human worth by follower counts and algorithmic engagement. She viewed her brother marrying a supposed middle-class tech worker as a personal affront to her brand. Now she was weaponizing her platform to extract maximum social currency from my exclusion. I swiped the notification, opening the application. The screen flooded with the bright, chaotic sunlight of the Miami cruise terminal. The loud, overlapping chatter of thousands of boarding passengers filtered through the audio feed, mixed with the distant blast of a ship horn. Kendra stood front and center, holding her phone high to capture her preferred angles. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a wide-brimmed straw hat that practically screamed manufactured wealth. "Look who is checking into the VIP terminal today," she shrieked, her voice pitched high for the camera. "We are skipping the endless lines and heading straight to the penthouse suites." She flipped the camera lens to show the priority boarding lane. Donovan stood a few feet away, adjusting the collar of the expensive linen shirt I had watched him pack hours earlier. He looked relaxed, projecting the unearned aura of a successful patriarch. Beside him, Todd leaned against a rolling suitcase, scrolling mindlessly through his own phone. Kendra turned the camera back to herself, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper intended for her thousands of digital strangers. "I just wish a certain someone could have joined us," she pouted, faking a sympathetic sigh. "But you know, some people prefer a pathetic broke staycation in the freezing cold over experiencing real high society. It is sad, really, watching someone refuse to level up." A shrill laugh pierced the background audio. Patricia stepped into the frame holding a plastic cup of terminal champagne. "Do not waste your pity," Kendra Patricia sneered, taking a large gulp of the sparkling wine. We offered to elevate her. We tried to show her the finer things, but at the end of the day, some people are just destined to be the help. Let her clean the gutters while we sail the tropics. The comment section, scrolling along the bottom of the screen, erupted in real time. I watched the text fly past, reading the usernames of mutual acquaintances, neighbors, and extended relatives. "So embarrassing for her," one user typed, adding a string of laughing emojis. "You guys deserve the upgrade," a neighbor commented. "Imagine staying home while your husband goes to the penthouse," a third chimed in. They were participating in a coordinated digital execution. My in-laws were actively using their platform to scorch my reputation, aiming to isolate me socially. They operated under the assumption that public humiliation would force me into quiet submission. They believed the shame of being left behind would prevent me from fighting back during our impending divorce. They wanted me to feel small, insignificant, and powerless. I picked up my ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee. The hot liquid grounded me, keeping my mind razor sharp. I felt zero humiliation. I did not feel the sting of rejection. I experienced only the pure clinical satisfaction of a predator watching its prey wander blindly into a reinforced steel cage. Kendra waved her gilded boarding passes directly at the lens, ensuring the platinum foil detailing caught the bright Miami sunlight. She was providing high-definition visual proof of the stolen assets. Every boast, every arrogant smirk, and every flaunted luxury item served as an irrefutable admission of guilt. They were ignorant enough to believe their fabricated reality could withstand legal scrutiny. They failed to comprehend the digital footprint they were generating with every passing second. In their desperate scramble to project wealth, they were handing me a pristine, time-stamped chain of custody. I set my coffee mug down and engaged the forensic screen recording software on my device. I captured the entire broadcast, logging the exact timestamp and the geographic coordinates embedded in the live-stream data packets. I archived the scrolling comments noting the specific individuals who cheered on the theft. I wanted a permanent record of every person who decided to align themselves with federal criminals. Kendra shifted the camera to highlight the private boarding bridge reserved exclusively for the premium suites. As she narrated the perks of their upgraded status, she was detailing the exact services purchased with my startup capital. The personal concierge, the priority dining access, the premium drink packages. She listed them all with breathless excitement. She was not documenting a luxury vacation. She was narrating a detailed, itemized itinerary of felony wire fraud. I transferred the video files, the captured metadata, and the screenshots to a secure offline server resting in my home office. I organized the data into a legal dossier matching every boastful social media post with the corresponding fraudulent bank transfer I had discovered the night before. The synchronization was flawless. The digital ledger matched their physical location with devastating precision. My in-laws thought they were establishing a dynasty of influence. They assumed their digital vanity would cement their status as untouchable elites. They were oblivious to the fact that they were live-streaming their own federal indictment. The broadcast ended with Patricia waving obnoxiously at the camera, blowing a sarcastic kiss toward New England before turning to walk up the gangway. Donovan followed close behind her, carrying the bags he had packed, while ignoring my final plea for our marriage. The screen faded to black, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the darkened glass of my phone. The woman looking back at me was done playing the role of the quiet, struggling startup founder. The mask of Gabriella Cole had served its purpose, allowing me to observe the true nature of the people I had welcomed into my life. Now that their genuine colors were permanently recorded and securely archived, the disguise was no longer necessary. The local mediator Donovan thought I was calling would never hear from me. A quiet, cheap divorce was off the table. The guppies had taken their bite and the water was rapidly turning red. I placed my phone back on the granite counter and walked toward the hallway. It was time to shed the suburban skin and awaken the empire waiting patiently in the shadows. The era of playing small was over, and the next phone call I made would alter the geography of our entire conflict. The silence of the suburban kitchen wrapped around me like a heavy wool blanket, but I no longer felt the need to wear it. The internal war that had tethered my instincts for 36 months dissolved into the cold morning air. I stood near the granite island, tracing the rim of my ceramic coffee mug. For years, I had negotiated a fragile peace treaty between my heritage and my desire for an ordinary existence. I wanted to build a life grounded in simple milestones rather than quarterly shareholder reports. I wanted a partner who saw me instead of a walking trust fund. My mind drifted back to the exact day I initiated this suburban experiment. A vivid memory surfaced, pulling me away from the frosty New Hampshire window panes. 3 years ago, I sat across from my father in his sprawling Manhattan office. The room smelled of aged cedar and sharp citrus cologne. He sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of reclaimed nautical timber, analyzing my request to live under a fabricated identity. I told him I needed to shed the Meyer surname to find someone authentic. I wanted to meet a man who would love Gabriella the marine biologist, not Gabriella the heir apparent. My father had leaned back in his leather chair, stapling his fingers together. His pale blue eyes mirrored the exact same calculating depth I possessed. He did not raise his voice or argue against my plan. He merely offered a profound warning that echoed perfectly into my current reality. "You cannot hide a whale in a fishbowl, Gabby," he had said, his tone a low, resonant rumble. "You can shrink your posture and dim your intellect to make the local wildlife feel comfortable, but eventually the guppies will realize you take up too much space and they will try to take a bite." He was right. Donovan and his relatives were nothing more than greedy little fish snapping at fins they could not comprehend. They mistook my engineered modesty for inherent weakness. They interpreted my frugality as a lack of resources rather than a disciplined choice. Their teeth had finally broken the skin, drawing blood through felony wire fraud and digital humiliation. The illusion of Gabriella Cole was officially dead. I left the kitchen and walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom. I bypassed the empty drawers where my husband had hurriedly packed his vacation clothes. I moved straight to the walk-in closet, dropping to my knees in the far corner. I peeled back a discreet section of the plush carpet to reveal a flush biometric floor safe. I pressed my thumb against the cool glass scanner. A sharp click confirmed the authentication. Inside the steel cavity rested a sleek satellite phone. It was an encrypted device utilizing a private network maintained exclusively by the Meyer Maritime Logistics Division. I had not touched the handset since the morning of my wedding. I lifted the heavy device, feeling the familiar weight of my true lineage. I pressed the power button, watching the screen illuminate with a stark white glow. I dialed the single pre-programmed contact. The line did not ring. It connected instantaneously, routing directly to the executive suite of our global headquarters. My father answered on the first second. He did not offer a standard greeting. "Gabriella," he said, his voice steady and sharp. The sound of my true name sent a jolt of pure kinetic energy through my veins. The final remnants of my suburban disguise burned away. "I am ready," I told him, keeping my diction flawless and direct. "The experiment is over. I am taking my rightful seat on the board." My father asked 0 questions. He required no tearful explanations regarding my failing marriage or the stolen startup capital. He understood the operational shift immediately. "Extraction is mobilizing," he replied. "The skies are clear. Welcome back." The line severed. The gears of a towering global empire engaged, shifting into high velocity. I stood up from the closet floor, leaving the secret safe open. I walked into the adjoining bathroom and stared into the mirror. The woman reflecting in the glass was preparing for war. I systematically dismantled my domestic camouflage. I pulled my hair back, twisting it into a severe, immaculate knot. I stripped off the practical fleece sweater and denim jeans I had worn to blend into local coffee shops. I threw them into a nearby wastebasket, discarding the fabric along with the fabricated persona. Less than 40 minutes later, a low hum vibrated through the quiet residential street. I walked to the front window. A synchronized fleet of 4 dark armored SUVs rolled into my driveway, blocking the entire cul-de-sac. The vehicles bore no license plates and featured heavily tinted bullet-resistant glass. They moved with terrifying military precision. The doors opened simultaneously. An elite extraction team clad in sharp-tailored suits stepped onto the asphalt. These were not standard bodyguards. They were seasoned corporate security specialists employed directly by our executive protection branch. The lead operative, a towering man with a severe expression, walked up the concrete steps and knocked twice. I opened the door. He offered a crisp, respectful nod, holding a garment bag encased in thick black canvas. "Your transport is secure, Miss Meyer," he announced, handing over the protective bag. "The flight crew is completing their pre-check on the tarmac." I took the bag and retreated briefly to the bedroom. I unzipped the canvas, revealing the bespoke tailored armor waiting inside. It was a flawless ivory silk suit cut with razor-sharp precision. I slipped into the garments, feeling the expensive fabric conform perfectly to my posture. The soft structure demanded respect. I fastened a vintage emerald watch around my wrist, clicking the clasp shut. The transition was total. I walked out the front door, stepping past the manicured lawn I used to mow myself. The brisk northern wind whipped past me, but I felt impenetrable. The lead operative opened the rear door of the primary SUV. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, enveloped by quiet, climate-controlled perfection. The door sealed shut, cutting off the outside world. The convoy accelerated smoothly, departing the quiet neighborhood without a single backward glance. We bypassed the commercial interstates, navigating a private route toward a secluded executive airfield tucked deep within the New Hampshire valleys. The towering pines flashed past the windows, retreating into the distance. We breached the perimeter of the private tarmac. Sitting alone on the runway was a sleek Gulfstream jet gleaming under the morning sun. The tail fin bore the subtle crest of the Meyer conglomerate. The engines whined with a high-pitched, eager frequency ready for immediate departure. The armored vehicle halted near the boarding stairs. I stepped onto the tarmac, flanked by my security detail. A flight attendant waited near the cabin entrance, offering a polite bow as I ascended the metal steps. The interior of the jet was a masterpiece of aeronautic engineering, featuring plush ivory seats and polished mahogany accents. I took my seat near the front of the cabin, buckling the heavy chrome seatbelt. The chief pilot stepped out of the cockpit, holding a digital flight tablet. "Good morning, Miss Meyer," he greeted, tapping the screen. "The airspace is cleared for our initial flight path toward the corporate headquarters in Manhattan. Shall I initiate the sequence?" I looked out the oval window, watching the security team load my encrypted server drives into the cargo hold. My in-laws were currently boarding a crowded commercial liner, believing they had outsmarted a helpless local tech worker. They thought they had secured their passage to paradise using my stolen funds. They were sailing directly into international waters where my family dictated the terms of survival. "Cancel the New York routing," I instructed, turning my gaze back to the pilot. My voice was a blade slicing through the quiet cabin. "File a new trajectory for the Caribbean. Set a direct course for St. Bart's." The pilot did not blink. "Acknowledged," he replied, altering the coordinates on his tablet. "We will be in the islands by early afternoon." He returned to the cockpit, securing the reinforced door. The jet engines roared to life, pushing the aircraft forward with incredible thrust. We lifted off the runway, tearing through the cloud cover and ascending into the boundless blue sky. The suburban constraints fell away, shrinking into tiny, insignificant dots far below. I leaned back into the leather seat, closing my eyes. The guppies were swimming toward tropical waters, and the apex predator was already en route to meet them. The Gulfstream tires kissed the sun-baked runway of Gustav III Airport with a sharp screech signaling my arrival in the tropical heat of St. Bart's. The cabin door opened, yielding to a rush of warm, humid air, thick with the scent of sea salt and blooming bougainvillea. I descended the metal steps, leaving the enclosed sanctuary of the jet for the vibrant, glaring reality of the Caribbean. A private black car waited on the tarmac, ready to transport me down the winding hillside roads toward the primary harbor. The journey took mere minutes, but the geographical shift represented a profound transition. The rugged, chilling isolation of New Hampshire was thousands of miles behind me, replaced by an azure bay teeming with floating fortresses of global wealth. I did not enter the harbor as a wandering tourist searching for a cocktail. I arrived as an undisputed titan returning to her domain. A sleek teakwood tender ferried me across the crystal-clear water, approaching the crown jewel of the Meyer fleet. The Ocean Aegis rested at anchor, a breathtaking feat of naval engineering stretching over 300 feet long. Its sleek titanium hull reflected the afternoon sun, while dark-tinted glass wrapped around the upper observation decks. This vessel was not merely a boat. It was a sovereign island of unrivaled luxury, carrying a staggering price tag of $350 million. Dual helipads sat idle on the bow and aft, ready to receive airborne guests. As I stepped onto the immaculate polished deck, a highly trained crew of 50 stood at rigid attention. They wore crisp white uniforms bearing the subtle crest of my family conglomerate. The ship captain, a seasoned mariner named Reynolds, stepped forward and offered a respectful bow. He welcomed me aboard, handing me a chilled glass of sparkling botanical water. I took a slow, refreshing sip, feeling the gentle sway of the ocean beneath my expensive leather heels. This magnificent floating palace was the culmination of 4 generations of relentless maritime innovation. My great-grandfather started with a single cargo freighter hauling steel across the Atlantic. My father modernized the fleet, expanding into global logistics and custom yacht manufacturing. For the past 3 years, I had suppressed this towering legacy, choosing to blend into the background of a suburban neighborhood. I had folded myself into tiny boxes to appease a husband who thought a chain restaurant gift card was the pinnacle of romance. Walking across the pristine teak floorboards, breathing in the refined air of my true heritage, I recognized the profound absurdity of my former disguise. Hours drifted by as I settled into the command suite on the uppermost deck. The suite featured floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows offering an unobstructed view of the entire harbor entrance. I watched smaller sailboats dart across the bay like silverfish. The tranquility of the afternoon shattered when a colossal shadow fell over the entrance of the port. A towering commercial cruise ship blared its deafening horn, vibrating the glass panes of my suite. It lumbered into the bay, resembling a floating shopping mall rather than a maritime vessel. Neon-colored water slides spiraled down its top deck, and the faint, chaotic thumping of amplified calypso music drifted across the water. It was a chaotic, bustling behemoth packed with thousands of sunburned passengers fighting for limited lounge chairs. This was the exact ship Donovan had booked using the stolen seed money from my tech startup. He had committed a federal felony draining my corporate ledger just to secure a cramped penthouse suite on this lumbering tourist trap. I walked out onto the private balcony of my suite, the tropical breeze catching the hem of my silk trousers. I retrieved a pair of heavy military-grade stabilizing binoculars from a teak storage box. Resting my elbows on the cool metal railing, I brought the lenses to my eyes. The internal gyroscopes hummed softly, instantly smoothing out the image and bringing the distant commercial liner into razor-sharp focus. I scanned the multi-tiered balconies scaling the side of the painted hull. I bypassed the crowded lower decks, focusing my search on the premium suites positioned near the bow. It took less than 2 minutes to find them. There, standing on a glass-enclosed balcony, was the family that had discarded me just a few days prior. Donovan leaned against the railing, holding a brightly colored drink adorned with a paper umbrella. He wore a loud floral shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, projecting the unearned confidence of a man pretending to be a millionaire. Kendra stood a few feet away, twisting her body into unnatural angles while her husband Todd snapped dozens of photos on a smartphone. She was undoubtedly capturing content for her digital followers, desperate to prove her elite status to internet strangers. My focal point shifted to Patricia. She wore an oversized woven sun hat that shadowed her face, but her theatrical body language was unmistakable. She stood near the edge of the balcony, gripping a tall champagne flute. I watched her gesture wildly toward the harbor. The magnification of the binoculars allowed me to track her manicured finger. She was pointing directly at the ocean aegis. I adjusted the focus, pulling her face closer. Patricia turned to a group of strangers standing on the adjacent balcony. Her mouth moved in rapid, boastful sequences. While I could not hear her words across the expanse of the bay, the context was blatantly obvious. She was puffing out her chest, claiming familiarity with the upper echelons of society. She was undoubtedly spinning fabricated tales about networking with the elusive billionaires who owned such magnificent mega yachts. The dramatic irony was so dense, it threatened to pull the oxygen from the air. Patricia stood on a crowded commercial balcony funded by stolen cash, bragging to tourists about her proximity to wealth. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that the daughter-in-law she had shoved a house-sitting manual toward was currently standing on the top deck of that very mega yacht, orchestrating her impending doom. She thought she was gazing at an aspirational dream. She was actually staring down the barrel of a loaded cannon. I lowered the binoculars, feeling a cool, calculating energy settle into my chest. They had arrived. The geographical clash was established. The prey had sailed directly into my designated hunting ground, but they were still separated by a stretch of open water and harbor security protocols. I needed to draw them out of their floating hotel and bring them directly onto my territory, where the power dynamic would be inescapable. I turned my back on the commercial behemoth and stepped back into the climate-controlled sanctuary of my command suite. I pressed a silver intercom button resting on the mahogany desk. Captain Reynolds responded instantly, his voice piping through the overhead speaker. I instructed the captain to join me in the suite, bringing the encrypted digital guest manifest system. When Reynolds arrived holding a secure tablet, I detailed my specific requirements. We were going to host a sunset networking gala on the aft deck of the Ocean Aegis. However, the guest list would be highly restricted. I directed him to draft a gilded, personalized electronic invitation. The digital pass was to be framed as an exclusive gathering of maritime elite and industry titans. I leaned over the desk, tapping the screen to finalize the delivery parameters. I ordered the captain to broadcast the invitation exclusively to the VIP and penthouse suites of the newly anchored commercial liner. The bait was perfectly tailored to exploit their insatiable social climbing hunger. It promised free-flowing vintage champagne, direct access to billionaire investors, and the ultimate photo opportunity for aspiring influencers. A family driven by unyielding greed and superficial vanity would never ignore a golden ticket to the most exclusive vessel in the harbor. Reynolds nodded, confirming the transmission sequence. He tapped the screen, sending the encrypted packets flying across the local harbor network. I walked back to the window, watching the lumbering cruise ship bobbing in the bay. The trap was laid and the scent of blood was in the water. It was only a matter of time before their blind arrogance drove them onto a tender boat, eager to step onto a deck where their fabricated reality would be permanently shattered. The encrypted transmission left my command suite and infiltrated the commercial ship guest network, bridging the gap between my fortified sanctuary and their fabricated paradise. I routed the digital pass directly to the localized application installed on their smartphones. The invitation materialized on their screens, featuring a sleek nautical crest and gilded typography. The text requested the honor of their presence for an exclusive Twilight networking reception aboard the Ocean Aegis, reserved strictly for the most distinguished patrons in the harbor. I sat back in my leather chair, watching the high-definition surveillance monitors linked to the harbor feeds. The reaction was instantaneous. Through the zoomed lenses of the port cameras, I observed the chaotic flurry of movement erupting on the balcony of Patricia Penthouse Suite. She held her phone aloft, waving the digital ticket at her son. Her posture morphed from casual tourist to frantic socialite in a matter of seconds. Patricia spent decades masking her middle-class reality with counterfeit designer handbags and rehearsed snobbery. She measured her entire human worth by her proximity to wealth, often returning worn dresses to department stores the morning after a country club dinner. Receiving a direct summons to a billionaire private vessel was the ultimate validation of her lifelong charade. Next door, Kendra turned her suite into a frantic production studio. She was a woman who lived her entire life through a front-facing camera chasing a digital ghost of fame. Her income relied heavily on hawking discount teeth, whitening teas, and pretending she received free luxury vacations. This invitation was a golden ticket to elevate her brand. I accessed the public social media streams, monitoring her public channel on a secondary screen. Kendra engaged her ring light, illuminating her cramped cabin in a harsh artificial glare. She pressed the live broadcast button. "You guys," she shrieked into the lens, pushing her hair over her shoulder. "The most insane thing just happened. We just got personally invited to a private Twilight gala on the biggest mega yacht in the harbor. They only sent this to the true VIP guests. I guess the owners noticed our aesthetic. We are heading over to rub shoulders with real industry titans." Her followers flooded the chat with fire emojis and envious comments. The dramatic irony was so thick it felt tangible. Her audience watched her preen and boast, believing she had finally ascended to the pinnacle of elite travel. They had zero idea she was broadcasting her own march into a meticulously engineered trap. She was painting a target on her own back live for the world to see. Beside her, Todd scrambled to gather his photography equipment. Todd functioned as a silent, obedient prop in her influencer fantasy, carrying her bags and snapping hundreds of photos until he captured the perfect, flattering angle. He swapped memory cards and polished lenses, eager to document their supposed elevation into high society. They spent the next hour preparing for the gala dressing in their most ostentatious, flashy garments. They assumed billionaires favored loud logos and glittering accessories, failing to understand that true generational wealth whispers while new money screams. I shifted my attention to the primary port camera, tracking the boarding area for the local tender boats. The sun began its slow descent, dipping toward the horizon and casting a brilliant orange glow over the turquoise water. The harbor hummed with evening activity. My in-laws emerged from the gangway of their floating hotel, practically vibrating with unearned pride. Patricia wore a sequined cocktail dress that caught the harsh harbor lights, looking far too theatrical for a maritime sunset gathering. Kendra strutted in towering stilettos that threatened to snap on the uneven wooden docks, clutching a velvet evening bag. But Donovan provided the most striking visual of all. He stepped onto the floating dock wearing a tight linen blazer and a cheap silk cravat tied haphazardly around his neck. He adjusted the fabric, attempting to mimic the effortless grace of the European aristocrats he had seen in magazines. He looked like a poor caricature of a yachtsman. As he waited for the tender, a stiff ocean breeze whipped across the bay. The flimsy silk cravat fluttered weakly in the wind, hitting him in the chin. The symbolism was sharp and profound. That cheap, fluttering piece of fabric perfectly represented his fragile, fabricated status. He had stolen startup seed money, committed felony wire fraud, and abandoned his marriage just to stand on a wooden dock wearing a ridiculous outfit. He was a hollow man holding onto a hollow life. The small, tender boat arrived idling against the pilings. Donovan ushered his mother and sister aboard, puffing out his chest as if he owned the harbor. The tender detached from the dock, navigating the choppy evening waves toward my vessel. I watched them approach the Ocean Aegis from my suite. The sheer scale of my family mega-yacht dwarfed the small transport boat. As they drew closer, the towering, immovable titanium hull cast a long, chilling shadow over them. The Aegis was a monument to genuine institutional power, engineered to withstand rogue waves and violent ocean storms. It stood in stark contrast to Donovan and his weak, fluttering silk tie. They were crossing the threshold, entering sovereign territory where my family dictated the laws of gravity. I turned away from the monitors. The digital surveillance phase concluded. It was time for the physical execution. I walked into the master dressing room attached to my command suite. The bespoke ivory suit I wore during the flight had served its purpose, establishing my authority. For the evening reception, I required garments that projected an entirely different frequency of dominance. I selected a flawless, flowing silk gown in a deep midnight blue. The fabric draped perfectly, commanding attention without relying on cheap, sparkling embellishments. I opened a velvet jewelry case resting on the vanity. Inside sat a pristine diamond collar necklace, a vintage piece commissioned by my grandfather decades ago. The flawless stones refracted the ambient light, casting sharp prisms across the room. The necklace alone carried a valuation higher than the commercial cruise ship my husband currently slept on. I clasped the cold platinum around my neck, the weight of the diamonds grounding my focus. I exited the dressing room and entered the central corridor. My personal corporate legal team waited near the elevator bank. Elias Thorne, my lead counsel, stood at the forefront holding a heavy leather binder. He was a ruthless legal architect specializing in hostile takeovers and high-stakes asset retrieval. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit, holding the binder with a calm, relaxed grip. "The paperwork is verified and expedited, Miss Cole," he stated, offering a brief professional nod. "Or should I say, Miss Meyer? Keep the binder sealed until I give the verbal prompt, Elias." I instructed, my voice echoing softly in the quiet hallway. "Let them enjoy the champagne first. I want them to reach the absolute height of their delusion before we sever the floorboards beneath them." "Understood," he replied, stepping aside. 4 elite security contractors flanked the corridor, wearing dark-tailored suits and discreet earpieces. They formed a protective wedge, ready to escort me to the main deck. We bypassed the elevator, opting for the grand glass spiral staircase that connected the upper command suites to the primary entertaining deck. The descent was deliberate and unhurried. Through the transparent glass steps, I observed the activity below. The aft deck was transformed into an elegant twilight reception. A curated selection of genuine harbor VIPs, affluent tech investors, shipping magnates, and foreign dignitaries mingled near the infinity pool, holding crystal flutes. A jazz trio played a soft, rhythmic melody in the corner. My security detail reached the bottom of the staircase, securing the landing. I paused on the 3rd step, lingering in the shadows of the mezzanine. The tender boat carrying my estranged husband docked against the lower swim platform. The hydraulic doors hissed open, granting them entry. I watched Donovan step onto the polished teak deck of my ship. His chest puffed out, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Patricia followed close behind him, looking around with wide, greedy eyes. Kendra raised her phone immediately, panning the camera across the infinity pool and the gathered billionaires, desperate to capture every second of her fabricated triumph. They believed their relentless social climbing had finally yielded the ultimate reward. They thought they had outsmarted a modest tech worker and successfully upgraded their lives using her stolen capital. They vibrated with supreme confidence, entirely ignorant of the jaws closing around them. I took a slow, steady breath, the cool ocean air filling my lungs. The trap was sprung, and the prey had eagerly swallowed the hook. I placed my hand on the glass railing, preparing to step into the light and introduce my in-laws to the true meaning of maritime dominance. The teak deck of the Ocean Aegis gleamed under the fading Caribbean sun. The tender boat hummed to a halt at the lower swim platform. The hydraulic gangway hissed, extending a polished metal bridge. Patricia stepped onto the pristine wood first. She wore a sequined cocktail dress that caught the twilight in jagged flashes. She immediately waved a manicured hand toward a pair of heavily armed security contractors flanking the entryway. "Garçon," she called out, projecting her voice to ensure the surrounding guests heard her. "We will take 3 flutes of your best reserve champagne. Tell the captain that Patricia and her family have arrived. We are close personal friends of the European shipping conglomerate." The security contractors remained still as statues. Their faces were chiseled stone, hidden behind dark, polarized sunglasses. They did not fetch champagne. They did not acknowledge her fabricated connections. Patricia faltered, an awkward grimace stretching her lips, but she quickly masked it by fluffing her hair. Behind her, Kendra stepped onto the yacht holding her smartphone high. The ring light cast a harsh white halo over her face. She narrated her arrival to a digital void, boasting about her elite access. Todd trailed behind her, laden with camera equipment, sweating under the tropical heat. Donovan brought up the rear. He tugged at the collar of his linen shirt, his cheap silk cravat flapping weakly in the cross breeze. The aft deck hummed with the quiet conversation of genuine industry titans. A French logistics chief executive swirled a glass of Pinot Noir near the infinity pool. A Silicon Valley venture capitalist leaned against the mahogany railing, discussing satellite acquisitions. These were individuals who shaped global economies. They did not shout. They did not demand attention. They observed. As my in-laws paraded onto the deck, the sophisticated crowd fell into a hushed, curious silence. The disparity between my family's loud, desperate performance and the quiet confidence of billionaires was stark. The guests watched Patricia snap her fingers at a passing steward, sensing the arrival of intruders. I stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, watching the spectacle. The trap had closed. I placed my hand on the polished glass railing and began my descent. My heels clicked against the translucent steps, a slow, rhythmic drumbeat cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. The elite crowd parted instantly. They stepped aside, clearing a wide path across the teak deck, bowing their heads in silent respect. I stepped into the warm glow of the evening lanterns. The midnight blue silk of my gown flowed around my legs like water. Around my neck rested a vintage platinum collar. The flawless diamonds fractured the ambient light, casting sharp prisms across the space. That single piece of jewelry carried a valuation higher than the commercial cruise ship currently anchored miles across the bay. Donovan looked up. His eyes locked onto my face. The smirk melted off his lips, replaced by a hollow, terrified slackness. His brain frantically rejected the visual data. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head side to side, unable to process the transformation. The quiet, frugal tech worker he had abandoned in New Hampshire was standing before him as the sovereign ruler of a floating palace. Patricia froze mid-sentence. She had her mouth open, preparing to demand a tour of the upper decks from a steward. The words died in her throat. Her jaw unhinged, hanging limp. Her eyes darted from my face to the diamond collar, her mind calculating the staggering net worth required to wear such an artifact. Kendra stopped her live stream narration. Her grip loosened. The expensive smartphone slipped from her manicured fingers, tumbling downward. The device clattered loudly against the pristine teak floorboards, the screen cracking upon impact. The sharp noise echoed across the silent deck, but she did not bend down to retrieve it. She just stared, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Todd gripped his camera strap, his face draining of all color. They were paralyzed. The illusion of their superiority shattered into a million jagged pieces. The woman they had mocked, excluded, and robbed was not a discarded victim. She was the apex predator, and they had just walked willingly into her domain. I stopped exactly 10 feet from Donovan. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a warm greeting. My tone was a freezing wind sweeping across the tropical deck. "Welcome to the Ocean Aegis," I said, my words slicing through the heavy silence. "I trust the tender ride from your commercial liner was satisfactory." Donovan opened his mouth, a choked gasp escaping his throat. He tried to speak, but vocal cords require oxygen, and he seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. I shifted my gaze to his mother. "Patricia," I continued, projecting my voice so every billionaire on the deck could hear the exchange, "I must express my profound gratitude. Your thoughtful exclusion at dinner provided the exact motivation I needed. If you had not handed me that pet care manual, I might have spent the rest of my life playing small. You gave me the push required to reclaim my rightful seat at the head of the Meyer maritime empire." The silence on the deck turned lethal. The elite guests began to whisper among themselves, the hushed voices weaving a tight net of judgment around my in-laws. A prominent shipping executive near the pool let out a quiet, mocking chuckle. The guests recognized the crushing power dynamic shifting in real time. They understood that the loud, sequined woman demanding champagne was nothing more than a classless grifter. Patricia looked around, her eyes wide and frantic like a cornered animal. The fabricated reality she had spent decades cultivating evaporated into the Caribbean breeze. Her counterfeit designer bags and rehearsed snobbery offered zero protection against the raw, unyielding weight of true generational wealth. I watched Donovan's hands tremble. He looked at the armed security guards flanking my sides. He looked at Elias Thorne, my lead corporate attorney, standing a few paces behind me holding a heavy leather binder. The reality of his situation began to pierce through his shock. He had forged a signature to steal $45,000 from the very woman who owned the vessel beneath his feet. He had committed felony wire fraud against a billionaire. The cheap silk cravat around his neck seemed to tighten, choking him. The cool ocean breeze did nothing to stop the heavy beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I watched a drop of perspiration roll down his temple. This was the precise sensation I had engineered. The clinical satisfaction coursed through my veins. For 3 years I had listened to Donovan lecture me on the intricacies of fine dining and luxury travel. He had taken me to mid-tier steakhouses and demanded I act grateful for the exposure to high society. He had sneered at my practical sweaters, claiming I lacked the pedigree to understand the ocean. Now, standing on the deck of a ship that carried a crew larger than his entire corporate office, his previous lectures felt like the babbling of a foolish child. I wore the ocean. My family mapped the logistics of the sea. His ignorance was not just insulting, it was profoundly embarrassing. The gathered investors and aristocrats stared at him, their expressions ranging from cold indifference to overt disgust. He was a trespasser in a world he had only pretended to inhabit. The initial shockwave settled, leaving behind a ruined landscape of shattered egos. But the human mind is a stubborn mechanism. When faced with total obliteration, a fragile ego will often seek a desperate, illogical lifeline. Donovan's breathing hitched, his chest rising and falling in rapid, jagged motions. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a trembling hand. The stark realization of his poverty clashed severely with his deep-seated entitlement. Instead of lowering his head and accepting his defeat, a dangerous flicker of defiance sparked in his eyes. He looked at the $350 million vessel, then at the diamond collar around my neck, and his greed overrode his basic survival instincts. He tightened his jaw, preparing to mount a defense built entirely on a foundation of marital delusion. The quiet deck braced for his next move, hinting at a new collision that would push him from mere embarrassment straight into legal devastation. The human ego is a fascinating instrument of self-destruction. When backed into a corner possessing zero leverage and facing an insurmountable threat, a fragile mind will often construct a fantasy rather than accept a devastating truth. I stood on the pristine teak floorboards of my vessel, watching this exact psychological malfunction occur within my estranged husband. The initial shock that had drained the color from his face was rapidly replaced by a surging, unwarranted flush of crimson. The blood rushed up his neck, pooling in his cheeks as his deeply ingrained entitlement fought a frantic battle against his basic survival instincts. He looked around the expansive twilight deck, observing the dual helipads, the infinity pool, and the silent, attentive crew members. He looked at the flawless vintage diamonds resting against my collarbone. His eyes widened, but not with fear. They filled with a sudden ravenous hunger. Instead of recognizing that he was an intruder standing on sovereign territory, he convinced himself that a marriage certificate granted him the keys to the kingdom. Donovan straightened his spine, puffing out his chest under the cheap linen fabric of his blazer. He took a bold, arrogant step forward, attempting to close the physical distance between us. My security contractors immediately shifted their stance, preparing to intercept. But Donovan threw his hand up in a theatrical gesture of command. "Stand down," he ordered, raising his voice to ensure the surrounding dignitaries heard his decree. "You work for us. I am her husband. I am the co-owner of this vessel, and I demand that you step aside immediately." The security contractors did not flinch. They did not blink. They remained rooted in place, staring through their polarized lenses at a man who carried zero authority. They answered to a single employer, and that employer was the woman standing behind them. The silence that followed his absurd command was broken by a soft, chilling sound. Elias Thorne, my lead corporate attorney, stood a few paces to my left, holding the heavy leather binder. A low melodic chuckle escaped his throat. It was the distinct mocking laughter of a legal architect who specialized in dismantling corporate raiders. Elias found the notion of a mid-level accounts manager claiming ownership of a global shipping asset genuinely hilarious. Donovan snapped his head toward the attorney, his jaw tight with indignation. "You think this is funny?" He spat, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. "We are legally wed. Under state statutes, all marital assets are subject to equal division. If she is the heiress to this ridiculous floating hotel, then half of this $350 million mega yacht rightfully belongs to me. I will take her for everything she is worth." The audacity of his claim hung in the humid Caribbean air. He was attempting to play the role of the dominant patriarch demanding tribute from a dynasty he had mocked just a week prior. I did not raise my voice to counter his shouting. I did not step backward. I held my ground, projecting the quiet, chilling authority of a chief executive officer. I looked at his flushed face, the sweat pooling near his hairline, and the frantic greed dancing in his eyes. I prepared to systematically dismantle his entire worldview in front of the gathered elite. "You truly believe a ring and a piece of paper grants you access to a century of maritime logistics, Donovan?" I asked, my tone dropping the ambient temperature of the deck. "You assume my ancestors built a global conglomerate without accounting for opportunistic predators looking for a quick payday." He sneered, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to project a hardened legal stance. "The law is the law, Gabriella. You hid assets during our union. A judge will tear you apart." I shook my head slowly, letting a razor-thin smile touch the corners of my mouth. "You possess a breathtaking ignorance of generational wealth preservation," I informed him. "This vessel does not belong to Gabriella Meyer. It does not belong to me as an individual citizen. The ocean aegis alongside the planes, the international ports, and the commercial fleets is the sole property of an irrevocable corporate trust. That trust was established by my grandfather decades before you ever learned how to tie a cravat." I paused, letting the legal reality sink into his frantic mind. "I am merely a board member acting as a designated beneficiary." I continued dissecting his fantasy with surgical precision. "The trust operates as a sovereign entity shielded by international corporate law. Your name is nowhere near the bylaws. You hold zero equity. You hold zero shares. You could hire every divorce attorney in New England and they would hit an impenetrable titanium wall. You own exactly nothing." Donovan parted his lips, searching for a rebuttal, but his legal threats evaporated. The color began to drain from his flushed cheeks once again. His chest deflated as the fantasy of a multi-million-dollar settlement turned to ash. But I was not finished. It was time to expose the reality of his fabricated lifestyle to the audience of genuine industry titans. "You stand on this deck attempting to demand billions," I stated, stepping slightly out from the shadow of my security detail. "Yet you seem to forget the actual math of your own existence. You work as a mid-level accounts coordinator at a regional logistics firm. Your annual salary after taxes barely covers the lease on the luxury sedan you insist on driving to impress your neighbors." He glanced around nervously, noticing the prominent venture capitalists and European shipping magnates listening intently to every word. The polished veneer of his success was being peeled back layer by agonizing layer. "For 3 years I listened to you lecture me on the importance of high society," I said, keeping my voice smooth and unrelenting. "You mocked my practical sweaters. You laughed at my thrift store purchases. You told me my marine conservation tech startup was a pathetic hobby. Yet you fail to realize that my supposed hobby generated the only real liquidity in our household." I gestured toward his designer shoes and the expensive linen blazer he had packed so carefully. "The startup you constantly belittled paid for your tailored suits, Donovan. The modest corporate ledger you scoffed at funded your country club dues. You strutted around Portsmouth projecting the image of a wealthy patriarch while secretly relying entirely on the unseen labor of your wife to subsidize your fake luxury. You are not a titan of industry. You are a dependent. You are a hollow shell wrapped in an unearned credit limit." Donovan stood stripped bare under the tropical twilight. The corporate bravado he relied upon to navigate the world was pulverized into fine dust. He was publicly reduced to a pathetic grifter caught trying to siphon resources from a woman he deemed inferior. The crowd of billionaires surrounding us did not offer a single ounce of pity. The French logistics chief executive shook his head, turning away in profound disgust. A prominent software developer whispered something to her companion, shooting Donovan a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. The elite guests recognized him for exactly what he was, an imposter who had smuggled his way onto a sacred sanctuary of genuine power. Patricia stood frozen near the railing, her sequined cocktail dress suddenly looking cheap and theatrical. She watched her son, the golden child she had praised for his ambitious social climbing, shrink into a trembling, humiliated fraud. Kendra remained staring at her cracked phone on the deck, realizing the family name she relied on for digital clout was currently being incinerated on an international stage. Donovan lowered his gaze, unable to meet the harsh, judgmental eyes of the surrounding aristocrats. His knees weakened, causing him to sway slightly against the ocean breeze. The social execution was complete. He had been exiled from the elite circles he desperately craved before he ever truly entered them. The silence returned to the aft deck, heavy with the scent of sea salt and impending doom. The utter destruction of his reputation was satisfying, but it was merely the opening act. Social humiliation is fleeting, but federal consequences are permanent. As Donovan stared down at the polished teak floorboards, Elias Thorne stepped forward from the shadows. The sharp sound of the attorney clearing his throat signaled a terrifying transition. The focus shifted from shattered egos to cold, irrefutable evidence. Elias adjusted his grip on the heavy leather binder, preparing to unleash a legal shockwave that would transform Donovan from a disgraced husband into a confirmed felon. The social execution left a ringing silence on the aft deck, but embarrassment is merely a fleeting emotion. Justice requires a much sharper instrument. I gave my lead corporate attorney a subtle nod. Elias Thorne moved with the calculated grace of a seasoned prosecutor, bridging the short distance between my protective detail and my estranged husband. The attorney extended the heavy leather binder, the embossed seal of my legal team catching the ambient lantern glow. Donovan stared at the portfolio as if it were a venomous snake refusing to lift his hands. Elias did not wait for an invitation. He pressed the thick binding directly against the chest of his target, forcing Donovan to grip the leather just to keep it from hitting the floorboards. "Inside that folder you will find heavily expedited divorce filings," I stated, my voice echoing across the hushed audience of industry titans. "The documentation terminates our union effective immediately, citing irreconcilable differences and egregious financial misconduct." My legal team filed the paperwork with the New Hampshire Family Court this morning. Donovan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. A quiet divorce was precisely what he thought I would pursue, an understated separation he could easily brush under the rug to protect his ego. But he failed to realize the divorce papers were merely the appetizer. The main course was far more lethal. I turned my gaze toward the upper mezzanine balcony where my security director monitored the proceedings. I raised 2 fingers. The response was instantaneous. A sprawling, high-definition cinematic display dropped seamlessly from the overhead canopy, unfurling against the twilight sky. The sudden mechanical hum drew the attention of every dignitary, investor, and aristocrat gathered around the infinity pool. The display flared to life, casting a stark, icy blue light over the immaculate teak deck. The screen did not show a promotional video or a corporate crest. It projected a raw, unredacted banking ledger. "While you were busy packing your designer suitcases," I explained, projecting my voice so every syllable landed with devastating clarity, "I decided to audit the operational accounts for my tech startup. You know, the modest little hobby you so frequently mocked. I expected to find my seed capital secured. Instead, I found a forged digital signature and a drained ledger." I gestured toward the glowing screen. "You bypassed the security protocols on a registered corporate entity." The digital display shifted, zooming in on a specific transaction hash. The crimson text illuminated the evening air, visible to everyone standing on the vessel. $45,000, I announced. "That is the exact amount you stole from my firm, and the routing numbers trace directly to the commercial cruise conglomerate you currently patronize." I shifted my focus to my mother-in-law. Patricia had been attempting to blend into the shadows, clutching her champagne flute like a life preserver. "Tell me, Patricia," I asked, pinning her under the glare of the spotlight. "How are you enjoying the penthouse suite?" Patricia visibly recoiled, taking a stumbling step backward. Her sequin dress caught the harsh blue light, highlighting her sudden intense pallor. The elite guests surrounding her audibly gasped, stepping away to create a wide circle of isolation around the disgraced woman. The realization hit the crowd in a localized shockwave. The demanding tourist who had spent the last hour dropping fake names and requesting premium service was not a wealthy aristocrat. She was sleeping in a cabin funded entirely by stolen capital. The sheer classless nature of the act caused the venture capitalists and shipping executives to sneer in open disgust. Patricia covered her mouth with a trembling hand, her fabricated high society persona incinerated in front of the exact people she worshipped. "You did not just take a few dollars from a joint checking account, Donovan." I continued, turning my attention back to the trembling man clutching the leather binder. You executed an unauthorized international transfer using falsified documents. Under United States statutes, that constitutes felony wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. You crossed state lines and international waters, utilizing illicit funds. Donovan opened his mouth, a pathetic squeak escaping his lips. He looked like a suffocating fish gasping for oxygen in a hostile environment, but the deepest cut had yet to be delivered. I needed him to understand the astronomical cost of his petty theft. The irony of your greed is truly spectacular, I told him, allowing a razor-thin smile to touch my face. That specific $45,000 was not random operating cash. It was earmarked for a very particular purpose. I was finalizing the expedited global patent filing for my proprietary marine filtration algorithm. I paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring the magnitude of the revelation would shatter whatever remained of his ego. As my spouse, you were legally positioned to claim 50% of any shared assets generated during our union, I explained, my tone dropping to a freezing whisper. The initial licensing rounds for that patent are conservatively projected to yield tens of millions in the first year alone. You were standing on the precipice of legitimate generational wealth. All you had to do was remain a decent partner. But by stealing the exact seed money required to file the patent, you committed a crime against the originating corporate entity. That felony legally severs your claim to any future royalties. I watched his eyes widen, the realization dawning on him like a slow-motion car crash. You traded a guaranteed fortune of tens of millions of dollars for a few days of free drinks and a larger balcony on a floating tourist trap, I stated, outlining the math of his sheer stupidity. You voided your own payout. The agonizing weight of his blunder broke him. His knees buckled. The man who had sneered at my practical sweaters, who had told me I lacked the pedigree to understand luxury, crumpled onto the pristine teak floorboards. He dropped the heavy leather binder, the divorce papers scattering across the deck like fallen leaves. Donovan wrapped his arms around his own torso, weeping openly. The guttural sobs echoed across the silent harbor. Please, Gabriella, he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pitiful whine. I made a mistake. I will pay it back. I will get a loan. Just call off the lawyers. Please do not do this. I looked down at him without a single ounce of pity. The lawyers are the least of your concerns, I replied, standing tall under the Caribbean stars. My legal team transmitted the unredacted transaction hashes to the federal authorities hours ago. The Department of Justice already has the forged signature logs and the merchant receipts. You are not facing a simple civil suit. You are facing a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The word penitentiary hung in the humid air, a terminal sentence that finalized his ruin. There would be no escape. The trap was secured with ironclad precision. Donovan buried his face in his hands, his tears staining the polished wood of my ship. Patricia remained frozen, hyperventilating in the shadows, her dreams of high society turning into a nightmare of impending interrogations. The men who controlled global shipping routes watched the pathetic display with cold detachment. But a family built on vanity rarely surrenders without attempting one final desperate maneuver. From the periphery of the shattered group, Kendra suddenly lunged forward. She snatched her cracked smartphone off the deck, her eyes wild with a frantic, cornered energy. The influencer realized her brother was heading to a cell, and her mother was a pariah, leaving her digital brand as their only remaining asset. She aimed the camera lens directly at me, her thumb hovering over the live broadcast button, intending to spin a desperate narrative to her followers. She thought she could weaponize the internet to save her family from federal ruin, setting the stage for a technological confrontation that would permanently eradicate her entire existence. Donovan remained crumbled against the polished teak floorboards, sobbing into his palms. His defeat hung heavy in the humid tropical air. The surrounding aristocrats observed him with cold indifference. However, the destruction of a golden child often triggers a frantic survival response in the remaining siblings. Kendra observed her brother turning into a confessed felon. She recognized the impending collapse of her own fabricated reality. Seeking a desperate lifeline, she reached down and snatched her cracked smartphone off the deck. The web of spider-glass did not deter her. To Kendra, the internet was the ultimate equalizer. She believed a viral video could rewrite reality and shield her from accountability. For half a decade, Kendra cultivated a digital house of cards. She hawked detox teas, promoted fast fashion, and projected a lifestyle of unearned affluence. Her self-worth was inextricably tied to metric engagement and follower counts. She viewed every interaction through the lens of a front-facing camera, believing that whoever spoke the loudest to an online audience controlled the truth. Facing genuine institutional power, she reverted to her only known defense mechanism. She aimed the shattered lens directly at my face and engaged her live broadcasting feature. "You guys need to see this," she shrieked, pitching her voice into a hysterical theatrical register. "My unhinged sister-in-law lured us onto this boat under false pretenses. She is holding us hostage and trying to frame my brother for a crime he did not commit. Please tag the authorities. Tag the news networks. We are trapped in the harbor and she's threatening us." Kendra expected me to flinch. She anticipated a frantic scramble to cover the camera or a desperate plea to preserve my public image. I offered neither. I stood perfectly still, allowing the evening breeze to rustle the silk of my midnight blue gown. I let her spin her frantic, fabricated narrative for a few fleeting seconds, letting her taste the illusion of control. Then I raised my right hand and executed a single sharp snap of my fingers. The Ocean Aegis was not merely a floating luxury hotel. The vessel served as a mobile command center for global maritime logistics engineered with defense-grade counter-surveillance architecture. A specialized localized signal jammer engaged the moment my security director received my auditory cue. Invisible electromagnetic waves flooded the immediate vicinity, neutralizing all civilian cellular and wireless frequencies. Kendra stared at her screen as the broadcast abruptly halted. The spinning loading wheel materialized, indicating a fatal loss of connection. The signal bars at the top of her display vanished entirely, replaced by a stark notification reading "No service." She tapped the cracked glass frantically, her manicured nails clicking against the surface in rapid, panicked succession. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice losing its performative pitch, turning raw and terrified. "Turn the internet back on right now. My management team will sue you for everything you own. My sponsors will ruin your brand. You have no idea how much influence I wield." I extended my hand toward Elias Thorne. The seasoned attorney produced a slim, pristine manila folder, holding it out to me. I accepted the document and stepped closer to the frantic influencer. I extended the folder toward her chest. She hesitated, her eyes darting between the paper and my stoic expression before snatching it from my grasp. "You frequently brag about your representation, Kendra," I stated, my tone echoing with clinical precision over the quiet deck. "You endlessly tag Zenith Talent Management in your posts. They are a reputable boutique firm catering to mid-tier lifestyle creators. They negotiate your endorsement rates and secure your brand trips. You rely on them to keep your digital ecosystem profitable." She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the crisp corporate letterhead. Her breathing grew shallow. What she did not comprehend was the complex corporate hierarchy operating above her boutique agency. Zenith Talent Management was acquired 6 months ago by a larger media syndicate, I explained, translating the corporate structure into plain, undeniable facts. That syndicate operates as a direct subsidiary of the Meyer Maritime Communications Division. I did not need to hack your phone, Kendra. I own your management agency. The realization struck her physical form like a heavy, blunt object. Her shoulders slumped. Her hands began to shake, causing the paper to rattle in the quiet evening air. The document she held was not a simple warning. It was an irrevocable notice of termination. Influencer contracts contain very specific legal riders. I continued ensuring the surrounding venture capitalists and shipping magnates heard the dismantling of her career. The morality clause is a standard inclusion. It dictates that any association with illicit activities, financial crimes, or public scandals grants the agency the right to immediately sever all ties without penalty. By eagerly accepting a penthouse suite funded by stolen corporate capital, you became an active participant in an ongoing federal embezzlement investigation. You documented the entire crime spree on your own public channels, providing the exact evidence required to trigger the clause. I paused, letting the magnitude of the legal maneuver sink into her mind. "I made one phone call this morning while you were busy trying to humiliate me online. Every single brand partnership you possess has been revoked. The vegan cosmetics company, the fast fashion boutique, the athletic wear sponsor, they all dropped you instantaneously to avoid the impending public relations disaster. Your affiliate links are dead. Your revenue streams are terminated." The financial reality for a mid-tier social media personality is notoriously fragile. They rarely possess substantial savings, often living paycheck to paycheck, channeling every dollar into maintaining the facade of wealth. Stripped of her sponsorships, Kendra was instantly rendered destitute. The designer velvet evening bag she clutched was likely purchased on credit, relying on next month brand payouts that would never arrive. Kendra dropped the manila folder. It hit the deck, sliding a few inches toward the infinity pool. She let out a piercing, guttural shriek. It was a raw, agonizing sound of pure psychological destruction. She clutched her useless, jammed phone to her chest. She had no platform. She had no income. She possessed zero future prospects in the only industry she understood. Her entire digital identity pulverized into dust by cold, hard corporate leverage. Todd, her silent, obedient husband, backed away from her. The color drained from his face as he realized their sole source of income had just evaporated in the Caribbean breeze. He looked at the expensive camera equipment hanging around his neck, realizing it was now nothing more than dead weight. The lavish lifestyle they had pretended to live was permanently canceled. Patricia watched both of her children get methodically dismantled within the span of 10 minutes. Her son was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. Her daughter was stripped of her career and rendered an impoverished pariah. The sophisticated facade Patricia relied upon shattered, giving way to sheer maternal panic. Her chest heaved. The reality of their entrapment pushed her toward a desperate, chaotic escalation. Convinced that local authorities would shield her from this corporate execution, Patricia spun around toward the gangway, preparing to play her final pathetic card. She filled her lungs, ready to scream for an intervention that would inevitably trigger an even more devastating demonstration of true institutional dominance. The breakdown of a matriarch who spent decades curating a facade of superiority is never a quiet event. Patricia witnessed her son reduced to a weeping felon and her daughter stripped of her digital livelihood. Her carefully constructed social hierarchy lay in ruins across the polished teak deck. Instead of retreating, her survival instinct pushed her into a frantic theatrical escalation. She refused to accept that her fake prestige held zero currency in my domain. She spun away from Kendra and rushed toward the starboard railing, gripping the varnished mahogany with white knuckles. Her chest heaved, pulling in jagged gasps of the humid Caribbean air. She leaned over the side of the vessel, her sequin dress catching the harbor lights, and began to scream. It was a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the sophisticated murmur of the gathered billionaires. She called out to the patrolling harbor police, waving her arms in wide, erratic arcs. She demanded an immediate intervention, shrieking that she was being held against her will, harassed and unlawfully detained by an unstable woman. She expected the local government to rush to her aid, believing her loud indignation would automatically summon justice. Her cries echoed across the dark water, bouncing off the hulls of neighboring yachts. A sleek harbor patrol interceptor equipped with flashing blue navigational lights idled mere hundreds of yards away. Hearing the commotion, the pilot throttled the engines. The twin outboards roared, cutting a sharp white wake through the bay as the municipal vessel angled toward the ocean aegis. Patricia turned back to face me, her chest puffed out, a triumphant, vindictive sneer replacing her earlier panic. "You went too far," Gabriella Patricia hissed, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "You think you can just kidnap people on the open water. You think your little boat puts you above the law. I am having you arrested. I will press charges for false imprisonment, emotional distress, and extortion. By the time I finish with you, your designer gown will be traded for a foreign holding cell." I did not offer a rebuttal. I simply watched the harbor patrol boat pull alongside our lower swim platform. The hydraulic gangway remained extended. A uniformed St. Bart's port official wearing a crisp white shirt adorned with epaulettes and a heavy-duty utility belt stepped onto the teak decking. He adjusted his radio, his face a mask of stern, uncompromising authority. He marched up the glass spiral staircase, his heavy boots sounding a steady rhythm of impending law enforcement. Patricia rushed forward to intercept him before he even reached the upper deck. "Officer, thank God you are here," she gasped, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "This woman lured us onto her ship under false pretenses. She confiscated our communication devices through some sort of illegal jamming technology, and she is threatening my family. I demand that you place her in handcuffs right now. I want her removed from this vessel and taken to the nearest precinct." The uniformed official stopped walking. He looked at Patricia, his brow furrowing slightly as he assessed her frantic demeanor, her flashy sequins, and the sheer desperation rolling off her skin. He did not reach for his restraints. He did not unclip his radio to call for backup. He simply bypassed her entirely, stepping around her flailing arms as if she were a minor obstacle on the deck. He approached the spot where I stood, flanked by Elias Thorne and my security detail. He stopped exactly 3 paces away. The official brought his polished boots together with a sharp click, stood at rigid attention, and delivered a crisp, formal salute. "Good evening, Miss Meyer," the official said, his tone thick with deep respect. Harbor Command registered a disturbance near your coordinates. We mobilized immediately to ensure your perimeter remains secure. Do these individuals pose a threat to your safety?" Patricia stood frozen, her outstretched finger trembling in the warm breeze. The triumphant sneer slid off her face, replaced by a hollow, breathless shock. Her brain struggled to process the interaction. The local law enforcement had just bypassed the supposed victim to salute the accused orchestrator. I smiled, letting the cool ocean air wash over the deck. "There is no threat, officer," I replied, my voice steady and resonant, just a profound misunderstanding of local infrastructure. I turned my gaze toward my mother-in-law, ready to deliver the geographical reality of our surroundings. Patricia spent her life navigating suburban homeowner associations and mid-tier country clubs, assuming the rules of those small ponds applied to the global ocean. "You believe you can summon the local authorities to arrest me on my own vessel, Patricia," I stated, stepping closer to her rigid form. "You assume this island operates like a public municipality, where a loud complaint warrants an immediate arrest. You fail to understand the true nature of institutional leverage. Meyer Maritime does not just sail luxury yachts into this bay. We dredged the deep water channels that allow vessels to enter. We built the primary concrete piers. We fund the customs checkpoints, the harbor patrol fleet, and the logistical radar grids that keep this port functioning." Her eyes darted nervously toward the uniformed official, searching for a denial, a contradiction, any sign that I was bluffing. The officer simply stood at ease, his hands resting on his utility belt, awaiting my next directive. He knew his paycheck, his pension, and his department operational budget flowed directly from the corporate entities managed by my family. But the depth of my dominion extends far beyond the concrete docks. I continued, preparing to drop the ultimate revelation. "You bragged incessantly about your premium reservation on that commercial cruise liner anchored across the bay. You flaunted your penthouse suite and your priority boarding passes, viewing that ship as the ultimate symbol of your elevated status." I gestured toward the distant glowing behemoth towering over the harbor. "Did you ever bother to read the corporate disclosures on your ticket, Patricia? Did you research the parent company that operates that floating tourist trap? Meyer Maritime holds a 68% controlling stake in that specific commercial cruise conglomerate. My family owns the hull, the engines, the dining halls, and the very penthouse suite you are currently sleeping in. I literally own the bed you plan to rest your head on tonight." The color drained from Patricia's face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. Her jaw trembled. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had tried to wield a commercial vacation as a weapon of exclusion against the woman who possessed the deed to the entire fleet. Her beloved ship was merely a tiny line item in my quarterly revenue report. "Officer," I said, shifting my attention back to the Port Authority official, "the individuals standing before you have just confessed to felony wire fraud and corporate embezzlement back in the United States. They utilized stolen capital to secure their passage. As the majority shareholder of the commercial line, I am officially designating them as an active federal security risk." "Understood, Miss Meyer," the official replied smoothly. "What are your operational directives?" I looked at the glowing cruise ship in the distance, then back to my mother-in-law's horrified face. "Revoke the commercial liner priority docking privileges effective immediately," I instructed. "Order the captain to detach from the primary pier and relocate the vessel to the outer anchorage miles beyond the breakwater. They can drop anchor in the rough, choppy currents of the bay until further notice." The official did not hesitate. He unclipped the heavy radio from his belt, pressed the transmission button, and relayed the direct order to the harbor master. The instructions echoed from the radio speaker in sharp staccato bursts, confirming the immediate expulsion of the staggering ship. Within minutes, a deep, resonant horn blasted across the dark water. The sound vibrated through the floorboards of the Ocean Aegis. We all turned to watch as the towering commercial cruise ship, glowing with neon lights, slowly detached from the concrete pier. The immense propellers churned the harbor water into white foam as the behemoth began its forced retreat, reversing out toward the dark, turbulent expanse of the open ocean. Patricia stood entirely silenced. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her entire worldview, built on loud complaints and fabricated entitlement, was crushed under the sheer, unyielding weight of authentic corporate power. Her floating sanctuary was sailing away, leaving her marooned on a deck where she possessed zero authority. The physical isolation was now established, setting the stage for a terrifying new reality. The luxury liner was gone, their return tickets were voided, and the harsh, inescapable truth of their frozen bank accounts was about to dawn on them, stripping away their final shred of hope. The colossal silhouette of the commercial cruise liner faded into the dark horizon, taking with it the final illusion of their safety. The rhythmic churning of its propellers vanished, leaving only the gentle lapping of the Caribbean waves against the titanium hull of my vessel. The physical isolation settled over the aft deck, a suffocating blanket of reality that snuffed out the remaining embers of their arrogance. They stood marooned on foreign waters, surrounded by genuine industry titans who viewed them as nothing more than an unfortunate disruption. The realization of their entrapment did not arrive in a dramatic explosion. It crept in through the cold, stark glow of a smartphone screen. Todd, who had spent the entire evening acting as a silent, obedient prop for his wife's digital vanity, plunged his trembling hand into the pocket of his tailored trousers. He had married into this dynamic expecting a seamless ride on the coattails of his brother-in-law's boasted wealth and his wife's internet fame. He never questioned the origin of the capital funding his premium beverage packages or his offshore excursions. Now desperation drove him to seek a lifeline. He raised the device, the biometric scanner unlocking the home screen. He bypassed the social media folders and tapped the dark blue icon of their primary financial institution, praying for enough liquidity to secure a flight back to New England. The loading wheel spun for 3 agonizing seconds. The interface rendered a stark slate-gray banner across the display. The typography was unforgiving. "Warning, asset freeze. Please contact the federal branch." Todd swiped down, his thumb smudging the glass, attempting to force a refresh. The numbers remained locked. Checking accounts displayed a flat 0. Savings ledgers showed the identical void. The premium credit lines they relied upon to fund their extravagant wardrobes were marked as revoked. The federal investigators back in the States had executed their warrants with surgical precision, severing the financial arteries the moment the embezzlement charges were filed. "It is gone," Todd whispered, the color draining from his face until his skin matched the gray hue of his phone screen. "Everything is blocked." Kendra lunged toward her husband, her acrylic nails digging sharply into his forearm. She snatched the device, her eyes scanning the brutal notification. She tapped the secondary tab linking to her influencer business accounts, desperate to find a hidden reserve. The screen displayed the identical freeze. The corporate acquisition of her talent agency meant her direct deposits were halted indefinitely. The promotional revenue she counted on to maintain her fabricated lifestyle had vanished into the ether. The logistical nightmare of their geographical location dawned on her in real time. St. Bart's catered exclusively to the global elite. The island possessed no budget motels, no discount hostels, and no cheap commercial airlines offering red-eye flights back to the mainland. A single night in a standard local villa commanded a price tag higher than her entire monthly ad revenue. Moreover, their designer luggage, their passports, and their return tickets were currently sailing away on a ship they could no longer board. They could not even afford the staggering bar tabs they had recklessly accumulated under their cabin numbers. They were stranded, penniless, and marked by active federal warrants awaiting their inevitable return to U.S. soil. The adrenaline rush that had fueled Patricia's theatrical screaming match with the Port Authority official rapidly evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, exhausted shell. Her body crashed. The oppressive tropical humidity settled over her sequined cocktail dress, turning the synthetic fabric into a suffocating weight. Her throat grew parched, her mouth dry from panic and shouting. She glanced nervously at the surrounding tables, where the venture capitalists and shipping executives continued to sip their vintage Pinot Noir, watching her downfall as if it were a mild theatrical performance. Patricia turned her gaze toward a passing deckhand, a young man carrying a silver tray of empty crystal flutes. Her voice, previously a commanding, arrogant shriek, reduced to a dry, raspy croak. She asked for a simple glass of water. The deckhand paused, his posture remaining rigid. He did not fetch a crystal goblet. He did not offer sparkling botanical infusions or premium reserve champagne. He looked toward me, seeking silent authorization. I offered a fractional, measured nod. The young man walked to a supply cooler, retrieved a plain, room-temperature plastic water bottle and handed it directly to the disgraced matriarch. It was a moment of profound poetic justice. The woman who had proudly declared my modest aesthetic an embarrassment, the woman who laughed while stating some people were destined to be the help, now clutched the cheap plastic container. She relied entirely on the unearned charity of the very crew she deemed beneath her just to hydrate her throat. The sequins on her dress caught the lantern light, serving only to highlight the vast chasm between her fake prestige and the genuine power dictating her survival. The reality of their destitution radiated across the deck. Donovan watched his mother unscrew the plastic cap with trembling fingers. He watched his sister stare blankly at a frozen bank ledger. His corporate bravado, his legal threats, his unearned arrogance, every shield he possessed had been systematically dismantled. Stripped of his leverage and facing the terrifying abyss of federal prison, he reverted to the oldest, most desperate tactic in the human playbook: emotional extortion. He remained on his knees, the pristine teak planks digging into his expensive linen trousers. He dragged himself forward, his leather shoes scraping against the wood. He reached a trembling, sweat-slicked hand toward the hem of my midnight blue silk gown. I took a measured step backward, maintaining an untouchable, sterile perimeter. Finding only empty air, he dropped his hand, letting it fall onto the deck. "Gabby, please," he wept, using the intimate nickname he had practically erased from his vocabulary over the last year. "You cannot do this. We took vows. We stood in front of our friends and promised to support each other through better or worse." Tears streamed down his flushed cheeks, tracking through the heavy perspiration pooling around his collar. He invoked the memory of our quiet evenings in New Hampshire. He recalled the dinners we shared, the walks through the White Mountains, the modest life I had meticulously curated to foster genuine connection. He attempted to weaponize those memories, twisting a history he despised into a fragile shield against his impending indictment. "I lost my way," he sobbed, his voice echoing with raw, unrestrained panic. He pointed a shaking finger toward his mother, desperate to shift the blame. "The pressure of keeping up with my family, the stress of the finances, it clouded my judgment. She pushed me to upgrade the suite. It was her idea. But I love you. You know I love you. You are my wife. Families protect each other. You have to protect me." His pleading was a masterclass in narcissistic desperation. He begged for the exact loyalty he had explicitly denied me just 7 days prior. When Patricia handed me a pet care manual in that upscale restaurant, he had sipped his wine in silence. When I offered him a final chance to tear up his cruise ticket during the suffocating car ride home, he had defended her cruelty and told me I dragged down his aesthetic. He packed his designer luggage while ignoring my presence, choosing a free vacation over the sanctity of our marital bond. Now, facing the cold steel of a holding cell and the terrifying reality of poverty, he suddenly remembered the value of a dedicated partner. He crawled another inch forward, bowing his head until his forehead nearly touched the floorboards. "Just give us the funds to fly home," he cried, his voice cracking into a pathetic, hollow whine. "Call off the investigators. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you the divorce without a fight. Just do not leave us stranded here. Do not leave me to rot in a cell." The venture capitalists and shipping executives watched his breakdown with silent, penetrating judgment. The spectacle was agonizing, bereft of any dignity or honor. He was a hollow man, begging for salvation from the very woman he had attempted to discard and rob. His tears did not soften the atmosphere, they merely highlighted the profound emptiness of his character. I looked down at the weeping figure, analyzing his pleas with the clinical detachment of a board member reviewing a bankrupt acquisition. The trap had closed, the assets were frozen, and the final rejection was primed to be delivered. Donovan's tears hit the polished teak, staining the pristine wood with dark, salty droplets. His shoulders heaved with unrestrained sobbing, a pathetic rhythm that shattered the refined ambiance of the evening reception. The venture capitalists and shipping executives standing along the periphery maintained a stony silence, their champagne flutes glinting under the warm lantern light. They observed his breakdown, not with sympathy, but with the clinical detachment reserved for a ruined competitor. I stood over the wreckage of my former husband, a monument of stillness. My heartbeat remained steady, a quiet, rhythmic drum against my ribs. I felt no urge to raise my voice. I felt no desire to gloat over his shattered ego. The woman who had packed his lunches, balanced his budget, and listened to his superficial complaints in a quiet New Hampshire suburb no longer existed. In her place stood a corporate executive finalizing the last stages of a hostile takeover. He kept his face pressed near the floorboards, waiting for a pardon that would never arrive. His fingers curled, scraping uselessly against the deck as if trying to dig a hole to hide inside. I looked down into his bloodshot eyes, watching the frantic, desperate calculations firing across his face. "You invoke the sanctity of our vows only now," I said, keeping my tone leveled, measured, and freezing. "You speak of loyalty when the federal authorities are waiting to measure you for a prison uniform. But loyalty is an action, Donovan, not a parachute you deploy to avoid hitting the ground." I stepped marginally closer, forcing him to crane his neck upward to meet my gaze. During that silent drive home from the restaurant, I gave you a chance to prove your character. I offered you a bridge. Instead, you chose to mock the very hands that funded your existence. You told me I dragged down your aesthetic. I paused, letting the evening breeze rustle the silk of my midnight blue gown. The fabric moved like liquid shadows around my ankles. You explicitly stated that I lacked the pedigree to understand true luxury. I gestured toward the staggering $350 million mega yacht surrounding us, sweeping my arm toward the illuminated infinity pool, the dual helipads, and the silent, attentive crew. Take a long look around Donovan. Observe the environment you tried to gatekeep from the woman who owns the deed. His throat bobbed. He tried to formulate a response, to spin another web of excuses, but his vocal cords betrayed him, producing only a weak, breathless wheeze. He was drowning in his own inadequacy, suffocating under the crushing pressure of a reality he could not manipulate. I shifted my focus away from his pathetic form. My gaze landed on Patricia. The matriarch was leaning heavily against a mahogany railing, clutching her room-temperature plastic water bottle like a life preserver. The saltwater humidity had destroyed her carefully styled hair, leaving frizzy strands clinging to her pale, sweating forehead. Her sequined cocktail dress looked absurd in this setting, a cheap costume worn by an actor who had forgotten her lines. She shrank backward as my attention turned toward her, her knees trembling beneath the hem of her skirt. The elite crowd watched her squirm, their eyes sharp with quiet judgment. She was a fraud exposed in the harshest possible light. "Patricia!" I said, the name rolling off my tongue like a formal indictment. She flinched, gripping the railing tighter. "At the restaurant, you made a very specific point regarding boundaries. You insisted on handing me a tangible reminder of my designated place within your social hierarchy." I reached a slow, deliberate hand into my designer evening bag. The leather was smooth under my fingertips. My fingers brushed against a thick, spiral-bound stack of paper. I pulled the document free into the twilight air. The laminated cover caught the ambient glow of the deck lanterns. It was the exact house-sitting and pet care guide she had slapped onto my dinner plate 72 hours ago. Patricia stared at the booklet, her eyes wide with a horrific recognition. She remembered the smirk she wore when she handed it to me, the cruel laughter she shared with her daughter. I did not thrust the book into her chest. I did not throw it. I simply held it over the teak floorboards and opened my fingers. The manual dropped. It hit the deck with a sharp, definitive smack, landing mere inches from her trembling designer heels. "You will need something to read while you sit in a federal holding cell," I informed her, my voice dropping to a surgical whisper. "I suggest you memorize the chapters on routine maintenance. The prison work details often require extensive sanitation duties, and I hear the wardens are quite strict about cleaning the floors." Patricia let out a strangled, breathless sound. The finality of the statement broke through her paralysis, sending a fresh wave of panicked tears spilling over her ruined makeup. She looked down at the manual, a physical manifestation of her own arrogance returning to seal her doom. The psychological dismantling was achieved. It was time to conclude the physical interaction. I looked at the group of them, a weeping husband, a paralyzed mother, a catatonic influencer, and a terrified prop of a son-in-law. The entire unit represented a toxic infection that had fed on my patience for far too long. "You planned this vacation as an exclusive excursion," I told them, addressing the entire shattered collective. "You bragged to your neighbors and your internet followers about embarking on a family cruise, specifically isolating me from your ranks. I am merely honoring the boundaries you established back in Portsmouth." I took a single step back, realigning my posture into a flawless, unyielding vertical line. "You are no longer my family, therefore your presence on this vessel is unauthorized. You are trespassing on sovereign corporate territory." I turned my head slightly, catching the eye of my lead security contractor standing near the glass spiral staircase. I offered a crisp, singular nod. The security detail mobilized with terrifying synchronized efficiency. The elite guards, clad in sharp, dark suits, stepped forward, closing the perimeter around the intruders. Two towering contractors flanked Donovan. They did not gently coax him to his feet. They reached down, gripping his biceps, and hoisted him upward with a sudden, jarring force. Donovan's legs failed to support his weight. He dangled between the two men, his expensive leather shoes dragging across the polished wood, emitting a high-pitched, wretched wail. He begged, thrashing weakly against their iron grips, pleading for a second chance that had expired days ago. His cries for mercy went entirely ignored by the guards, who marched him toward the hydraulic gangway with blank, professional expressions. A third guard stepped toward Patricia. The matriarch began hyperventilating, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow spasms. She stumbled forward, dropping her plastic water bottle. It rolled away, spilling its plain contents across the deck, a final insult to her champagne tastes. She offered no resistance, her spirit entirely crushed under the sheer gravity of her impending incarceration. She allowed the guard to guide her toward the exit, her eyes vacant, her mouth moving in silent, disjointed prayers to a high society that had permanently rejected her. The sequined dress sagged on her frame, bereft of the false confidence that once filled it. Kendra remained frozen near the infinity pool. The influencer had retreated deep into her own mind, entering a state of total catatonia. The loss of her digital empire had effectively severed her connection to reality. Her phone lay shattered on the floorboards, a dead piece of glass and metal. Her husband, Todd, wrapped a shaking arm around her shoulders, attempting to shield her from the piercing stares of the gathered billionaires. A guard pointed a stern finger toward the metal bridge, silently instructing Todd to move. The photographer nodded frantically, guiding his unresponsive wife toward the departure point. He kept his head bowed, thoroughly humiliated by the sheer magnitude of their public eviction. The procession of disgraced social climbers shuffled across the metal bridge. The tender boat bobbed in the dark water, its engine idling, ready to transport the cargo of felons back to the concrete pier. I stood near the mezzanine staircase, maintaining my position. I did not follow them to the railing. I did not offer a parting insult or a wave goodbye. The elite guests of the Ocean Aegis watched in fascinated silence as the guards deposited the weeping, broken group into the small transport vessel. The tender detached from the swim platform, the engine revving as it pulled away from the towering titanium hull of my ship. The sound of Donovan's sobbing drifted across the water, growing fainter with each passing second until it was entirely swallowed by the rhythmic crash of the Caribbean waves. I watched the small boat shrink into the distance, carrying the toxic remnants of my past back to a desolate shore. The evening breeze swept across the deck, clearing away the stale tension they had brought aboard. My spine was straight, my breathing slow and even. The rot was entirely excised from my life. A clean, pristine horizon stretched out before me, devoid of parasites and built on a foundation of undeniable truth. The surgical extraction was over, paving the way for the ultimate tranquil departure. The small tender boat navigated the choppy evening currents, carrying its cargo of disgraced exiles away from the sanctuary of my vessel. I remained near the glass railing, watching their humiliating return to the local shores. The municipal concrete pier was a stark utilitarian stretch of harbor infrastructure, a harsh contrast to the luxurious environment they had desperately tried to claim. Bright halogen floodlights illuminated the dock, casting long, unforgiving shadows over the rough stone surface. As the tender bumped against the heavy rubber bumpers of the pier, a group of harbor workers and passing tourists paused to observe the spectacle. The scene unfolding before them was entirely pathetic. Donovan stumbled onto the concrete, his expensive leather shoes slipping on a puddle of spilled diesel fuel. His tailored linen blazer was wrinkled and stained with his own tears, his posture broken by the unbearable weight of his impending federal indictment. He looked like a hollowed-out shell, stripped of the unearned bravado that had fueled his entire existence. Patricia followed him, practically crawling off the transport boat. Her sequined cocktail dress, chosen specifically to dazzle billionaires, now looked like a cheap, discarded costume under the glaring harbor lights. The saltwater spray had ruined her theatrical makeup, leaving dark streaks running down her cheeks. She stood shivering on the dock, surrounded by sunburned tourists eating ice cream and dock hands coiling thick nylon ropes. The local crowd pointed and whispered, their laughter drifting across the bay. Patricia, the woman who had spent decades meticulously curating an illusion of supreme aristocratic superiority, was now the punchline of a Caribbean harbor joke. She had mocked me, claiming I was destined to be the help, yet she now stood marooned, entirely reliant on the charity of the local authorities just to secure a place to sit. Kendra had to be physically guided off the boat by her silent husband. The influencer remained trapped in a state of sheer catatonia, her eyes vacant, clutching the shattered remains of her smartphone. The digital empire she worshipped had vanished, taking her entire identity with it. They were a collective monument to the devastating consequences of unyielding greed. They possessed no luggage, no return flights, and zero access to liquidity. The commercial cruise liner that held their passports and their temporary penthouse suite was currently anchored miles out in the dark, turbulent ocean, banished from the port under my direct corporate mandate. They were stranded in an elite global playground with empty pockets, awaiting the inevitable arrival of federal marshals. I turned away from the miserable tableau playing out on the docks. I ascended the glass spiral staircase, leaving the twilight reception behind, and moved toward the uppermost observation deck of the Ocean Aegis. The air at this altitude was crisp and clean, untainted by the desperation I had just excised from my life. A seasoned steward wearing a crisp white uniform approached me, carrying a polished silver tray. He offered a slight, respectful bow and presented a fresh crystal flute of vintage champagne. I accepted the glass, my fingers tracing the delicate stem. The condensation was cold and grounding against my skin. Below me, the sophisticated gathering of venture capitalists and logistics magnates had already returned to their evening discussions. The swift, clinical removal of the intruders had only solidified my authority in their eyes. They recognized the seamless execution of institutional leverage, and the atmosphere on the aft deck resumed its elegant, rhythmic flow. The jazz trio picked up a lively tempo, entirely unfazed by the familial execution they had just witnessed. Captain Reynolds stepped out of the bridge, approaching the observation deck with a digital navigation tablet in hand. He stopped a few paces away, his demeanor reflecting decades of disciplined maritime service. "The perimeter is clear, Madam CEO," the captain announced, his voice steady over the ambient ocean breeze. "The harbor master has granted our departure clearance. We are ready to navigate out of the bay at your command." I looked out over the sprawling harbor, my gaze sweeping past the anchored sailboats and the glittering hillsides of St. Bart's. I had arrived on this island to settle a score, to dismantle a fraudulent reality constructed by toxic parasites. That objective was achieved with terrifying precision. There was nothing left for me here. "Take us out, Captain," I instructed, raising the crystal flute to my lips. "Set a course for open water." "Acknowledged," he replied, turning swiftly to relay the orders to the bridge. A few seconds later, the true towering scale of my domain awakened. The colossal twin engines of the mega yacht ignited deep within the titanium hull. It was not a sudden jarring noise, but a profound bone-rattling vibration that resonated through the floorboards and traveled straight up my spine. The sheer torque of the propulsion system churned the harbor water, generating a deep guttural hum that signaled the movement of an undeniable titan. The Ocean Aegis began to glide forward, cutting through the turquoise Caribbean waves with effortless, majestic grace. Across the bay, standing on the rough concrete pier, Patricia realized the vessel was departing. The panic that had paralyzed her suddenly mutated into a final, hysterical burst of frantic energy. Even from my elevated vantage point, I could see her waving her arms wildly, running toward the edge of the dock. Her mouth opened wide, her face contorted into a mask of pure agony. She was screaming, likely hurling insults, begging for a rescue, or demanding a reversal of her catastrophic ruin. Her shrill voice tried to cross the expanse of the dark water, a desperate plea from a drowning woman. I did not want to hear her voice ever again. I did not want the final memory of this evening stained by her frantic shrieking. I caught the eye of the first officer standing near the bridge controls. I offered a singular, subtle gesture, pointing my index finger upward. The officer engaged the primary acoustic signal. The mega yacht horn blasted, a deafening, earth-shaking roar that erupted into the night sky. The sheer decibel level shattered the quiet harbor air, vibrating right through my chest. It was a beautiful, overwhelming wall of sound. The deep, resonant blast completely consumed Patricia's distant screams, wiping her frantic voice from existence. The toxic noise she had polluted my life with was permanently drowned out by the undeniable roar of an empire in motion. The horn faded, leaving only the rushing sound of the ocean breaking against the bow. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage champagne. The taste was sharp, cold, and flawless. The $350 million vessel picked up speed, navigating past the stone breakwater and leaving the glittering harbor behind. I stood near the railing, watching the island of St. Bart's shrink into the distance. The towering hillsides and the crowded municipal docks faded into tiny, insignificant specks on the dark horizon. The people who had tried to shrink my posture, who had attempted to relegate me to the role of a disposable prop, were now trapped on that fading rock, waiting for the federal justice system to consume their remaining years. My father had been right. You cannot hide a whale in a fishbowl, and when the guppies try to take a bite, they simply get swallowed whole. The ocean breeze whipped through my hair, clearing away the last remnants of my suburban disguise. I was no longer a tech worker navigating a cramped, ungrateful marriage. I was the sovereign ruler of a global logistics fleet, steering my legacy toward a limitless horizon. I turned my back on the shrinking island, letting a cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. The execution was flawless, the revenge was pristine, and the rot was entirely excised from my universe. True power does not scream from a concrete pier. True power does not beg for validation. It simply sails away. Thank you so much for listening to this journey of ultimate reclamation. Dealing with manipulative individuals who try to diminish your worth can be an agonizing, isolating experience, but their arrogance is always their greatest vulnerability. Have you ever had to drop your disguise and show a toxic person exactly who they were dealing with? How did you execute your own flawless exit? I would love to read your stories of survival and triumph in the comments section below. Your courage can be the blueprint someone else needs to break free. If you enjoyed watching this fraudulent family receive their undeniable karma, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of sweet, calculating revenge. Remember, you never have to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's shallow reality. Stay strong, know your worth, and keep sailing forward. When the colossal, shimmering silhouette of the ocean aegis finally disappeared into the dark, churning expanse of the Caribbean horizon, it left behind more than just the physical wreckage of three stranded individuals. On the surface, the story of Gabriella and her meticulously orchestrated retribution is a triumphant masterclass in reclaiming one's stolen power. We cheer as the mega yacht sails away, leaving the architects of her misery marooned on a concrete dock. But if we allow the adrenaline of that flawless revenge to settle, and if we peer beneath the layers of forged signatures, frozen bank accounts, and canceled sponsorships, a much deeper, more agonizing tragedy reveals itself. We are not merely looking at the collapse of a marriage or the exposure of a fraud. We are bearing witness to the catastrophic failure of a mother and the generational rot that inevitably follows when the sacred duty of parenting is traded for the cheap, glittering counterfeit of social prestige. In American culture, the traditional family structure has long been idealized as the ultimate sanctuary of moral development. It is within the quiet walls of the home that children are supposed to be handed the blueprints for their humanity. It is where they are meant to learn the indispensable, foundational values of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. But what happens when the architect of that home is entirely spiritually bankrupt? Patricia did not raise children. She curated accomplices. She built a household not on the bedrock of integrity, but on the shifting, treacherous sands of optics and entitlement. When a mother sits at an upscale restaurant in New Hampshire, hands her daughter-in-law a pet care manual, and rewards her biological children with stolen luxury, she is not simply executing a petty, mean-spirited joke. She is actively instructing her adult children that human dignity is entirely transactional. In her desperate, lifelong scramble to project an aristocratic aesthetic, a frantic pursuit of the American illusion of superiority, Patricia completely abandoned her long-term family responsibility. She failed to provide the steady, grounding guidance that anchors a child in reality. Instead, she chose to inflate their egos with the helium of unearned privilege, tying them to a cinderblock of profound delusion. Look closely at Donovan. How does a man look his wife in the eye, pack his designer suitcases, and blindly steal her hard-earned startup capital to upgrade a cruise cabin? It is a staggering betrayal that defies basic human decency. But this behavior does not manifest out of thin air. It thrives because it was cultivated in an emotional vacuum. Donovan lacked the fundamental psychological architecture required to feel guilt, because he was raised in an environment where accountability was treated as an inconvenience. True family responsibility requires parents to hold a mirror up to their children, forcing them to confront their flaws, to acknowledge the pain they cause others, and to take unyielding ownership of their mistakes. A healthy family operates as a greenhouse for empathy. Patricia, however, shielded her children from the mirror. She applauded Donovan's fraudulent social climbing and enthusiastically cheered on Kendra's hollow, vapid digital empire. By prioritizing their external success over their internal character, she robbed her children of emotional awareness. She taught them that fairness is secondary to appearing victorious, and that honesty is merely an obstacle to getting what you want. She left them entirely defenseless against a world that ultimately demands authentic substance. When the illusion was violently shattered on the teak deck of that mega yacht, Donovan and Kendra had no inner reservoir of strength to draw upon. Stripped of their stolen funds and fake status, they could only weep, beg, and collapse into themselves. They were hollow vessels, echoing with the failures of the woman who raised them. Contrast this tragic, preventable decay with the quiet, formidable strength instilled in Gabriella. Her father, a billionaire who commanded a global logistics empire, possessed the resources to shield his daughter from every conceivable hardship. He could have bought her an insulated, frictionless reality. Instead, he taught her the chilling, vital truth about the world. He warned her that she could not hide a whale in a fishbowl, and that eventually the guppies would try to take a bite. He provided long-term guidance that transcended bank accounts, focusing instead on fierce independence, self-reliance, and the absolute necessity of emotional restraint. He taught her how to stand firmly on her own 2 feet, rather than standing on the necks of others. That is the essence of genuine parental duty. Preparing a child for the predators of the real world by armoring them with unshakable self-worth. Authentic parenting within the modern American landscape must urgently return to these foundational roots. It demands the grueling, often unpopular work of teaching children that true luxury is not a penthouse suite or a viral live stream, but the quiet, untouchable peace of mind that accompanies a clean conscience. It requires raising children who understand that fairness is not about getting what you want, but about honoring the boundaries and the intrinsic humanity of the people around you. When we raise children with a deep, resonant emotional awareness, we armor them against the shallow, suffocating temptations of a status-obsessed society. We give them the tools to navigate the complexities of life with a spine of steel and a heart of undeniable integrity. If you have ever had to heal from the invisible wounds inflicted by a fractured upbringing, or if you are currently doing the grueling, beautiful work of breaking generational cycles of toxicity to build a better life for yourself, you do not have to walk that path alone. I invite you to subscribe and follow Sarah Told Stories. Here we shed light on the darkest corners of human relationships, challenge the toxic narratives we were handed, and celebrate the triumphant reclamation of our own self-worth. Join our community as we explore the stories that remind us of who we are, and more importantly, who we have the absolute power to become. As we reflect on the weeping figures left stranded on the concrete pier of St. Bart's, we are forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable philosophy about how we love and how we lead the next generation. Conventional American wisdom dictates that a parent's ultimate duty is to serve as a perpetual safety net. We are socially conditioned to believe that the pinnacle of family responsibility is building a fortress around our offspring, ensuring they never feel the sting of failure, the agonizing humiliation of defeat, or the harsh, unforgiving consequences of the real world. We treat parental love as an unconditional protective barrier, measuring our success as mothers and fathers by how much pain and discomfort we can spare our children. But I offer a radically different truth. The greatest, most devastating disservice you can ever do to a human being is to protect them from the consequences of their own moral decay. When we perpetually cushion their falls, when we lie for them, fund their delusions, and shield them from accountability, we do not save them. We cripple them. We transform them into fragile, hollow adults who will inevitably shatter into a million irreparable pieces the moment they encounter a world that refuses to coddle them. The most profound, agonizing act of parental love is not the shield. It is the willingness to let the fortress burn. True family devotion is looking at the child you brought into this world and absolutely refusing to bail them out when they choose to act with cruelty, arrogance, and greed. It is the excruciating discipline of stepping back and allowing them to hit rock bottom at terminal velocity. Because it is only in the dark, shattered ruins of their own unearned arrogance that a person can finally learn the true cost of their actions. Sometimes the highest, purest form of love is walking away and letting the world brutally teach the lesson you were too cowardly to impart. You cannot save someone by carrying their sins. Sometimes you just have to let them crawl through the wreckage.